Welcome to Landscape Photo Editing Sessions. I'm Rayata Arkiri. In this episode, I'm going to be editing a star trail photo. I'm going to be combining a foreground from when it was still light out with the star trails when it got darker. Alright, so I have a time-lapse sequence over here. It goes from astronomical twilight all the way to a little bit over an hour later. So these are all 30-second exposures. Alright, so first I'm going to process the foreground layer. So I'm going to go to my develop module. This is the first shot that was taken. So I guess it wasn't only the ones later on are 30 seconds. So the one over here is 1.3 seconds. And there's just some stars out because it's still astronomical twilight, but still light enough to see the mountain. So I'm going to process this for the foreground. So I want to make the mountain a little bit more warmer tones and a bit more red. I'm going to make the temperature warmer. And I'm just going to add a little bit more magenta to the image. Alright, I'm going to take down the highlights just a little bit and bring up the shadows to get more detail in those rocks over here. I'm going to increase the contrast just a little bit. And I want to increase the whites just a little bit too. It'll bring out a little bit more contrast. And I'm just going to check the blacks. Okay. And I'm just going to give it a little bit of vibrance. Alright, so I like that color in the mountain. Looking pretty good. I'm not going to do any sharpening because I'm actually going to combine 16 of these photos to average them out so that the noise gets reduced. So I don't need to do any noise reduction. But I am going to go to the lens corrections, enable that. Alright. And one more thing. There's a color cast around the edges. I want to get rid of that. So I'm going to go to my adjustment brush tool. I'm going to reset all the settings and then change the tint to more green and then just paint in the edges. I think it needs more green. Alright. I'm gonna have to create a new one, and it needs a little bit more over here on these edges. Alright, so that's decent enough. I'm gonna go back, reset the exposure. Alright, so I'm done with these images. I'm gonna go to my library and copy these to the other photos. So I'm gonna use 16 photos, and I think that's a good amount for the duration, and also it's a good amount for noise reduction. So I'm going to press Ctrl-Shift-C to copy the settings. And then I'm going to shift click. So I'm going to count 16 of them. Once I have it selected, I'm going to paste the settings. And then I'm going to open them as layers in Photoshop. I have all the layers open in Photoshop, and to average out the noise, I'm going to select them all and convert them to a smart object. After the smart object is created, I'm going to go to Layer, Smart Objects, Stack Mode, and change it to Mean. So this will average out all the layers into one. So that's a huge difference. It actually made it look like a long exposure too. So it emulated a long exposure, so those clouds look more like streaks now. And it also reduced most of the noise. Alright, so that's good. I'm going to go ahead and rasterize that. So rasterizing it will basically merge all the layers together and it'll clear out all my RAM, or should. So now I'm going to go back into Lightroom and I'm going to start editing the photo for the star trails. So I want to find the photo where it started or became dark, and I know the time is 6:59 was the end of astronomical twilight, so that's when it got dark. So I'm going to go ahead and find the one that was taken at 6:59. Okay, this is good. And then I'm going to go to my develop module. Make sure I enable profile corrections. And then I'm just going to do auto white balance. The white balance here doesn't really matter that much because I just want the star trails. So I want to increase the contrast. I want as much contrast as possible so I can get the stars defined as much as possible. So I'm also going to increase the whites by a good amount. And I'm going to take the exposure way down. I'm also going to reduce the blacks until the sky is almost clipped. So the sky is almost black and the stars are very visible, so that's what I want. And that's all I need to do for the editing. To create star trail shots, it's nice to have the North Star in the image because that's how you can create the spiral effect. Right here is the North Star, and this was over the Mauna Kea on the Big Island. Alright, so I'm going to copy the settings, Control-Shift-C, and then paste it on the rest of the images. And then I'm going to open all of these layers in Photoshop, and it's going to take a really long time. Alright, so the files are finally open in Photoshop, and I'm going to select them all. So to create the star trails, I want to change the blending mode to lighten, and that will basically take all the brightest parts of the image and allows it to see through. So it basically makes the darker parts invisible. Alright, so the problem now is that there's a lot of lines over here. So these are satellites and planes. And the way to remove them is to go to each individual file and clone them out. So an easy way to do that is to solo the bottom layer and then just go a few layers at a time and just keep checking on them. So there's no satellites or anything in this image, so I'll go a few more stars. Looks clean. I'm gonna go a few more stars. So I'm just gonna keep going. Alright, so over here there is one over here. So this one's a satellite. So I'm gonna go back. So it starts out in this layer. So I'm gonna go with this layer, use my spot healing brush tool, size it down so it's the appropriate size, and then just brush that out. Alright, I'm gonna go to the next layer and brush this one out. And then the next layer. Alright, so that's all. So I'm going to keep going. A few more. Let's see. So over here there's some plane trails, so I'm going to clone those out. Alright, I finally got most of the satellites and planes. So I'm going to go ahead and merge all these layers together. So if I select them all and press Ctrl E, that'll merge them into one layer. So the problem with shooting star trails is if you shoot a time lapse, and even if you have a slight split second in between the exposures, it's still going to create a little bit of a space between the stars. So I'm going to show you one way to fill the stars, and that is I'm going to create a duplicate layer. So I want to fill these gaps, and I want to actually rotate this layer just a tiny bit and set the blending mode to lighten so that it'll actually fill those gaps a little bit. So the way to do that is to press Ctrl T. So I'm going to transform the tool, and I'm going to change the center point, and I'm going to put it right in the center over here. So this is the North Star over here, but it's not actually the center. So I gotta actually find the center. So it should be just around here. And I'm just gonna rotate the image just by 1 degree. And that should do it. So I mean 0.1. So 0.1 degree. And then set the blending mode to lighten. Alright, so now if I show that, the gaps get filled just a little bit and it looks better. Alright, so that's a bit better. And I'm going to go ahead and merge these two layers together. And I'm going to bring it into the other document with the foreground layer. Alright, I'm going to make sure those are aligned correctly. Okay, looks good. The next thing I want to do is select the mountain out, or the foreground. So I'm going to select the foreground image and go to my quick selection tool. And I'm going to select the mountain. So I'm going to zoom in and make sure that selection is pretty good. Alright, I'm going to go to the refine edge tool and maybe increase the radius to around 2. So that'll make the selection a lot better. And then I'm gonna go to my star trail layer and create the layer mask on this layer. And then I'm gonna invert that mask so that only the stars are visible. Alright, and then I'm gonna set the blending mode to lighten. So that will allow the dark parts to pass through. But the problem now is it kind of took away the star trail effect, and it's only allowing the brightest parts of the star trails to show through. So the way to fix that is I'm going to duplicate this layer, and I'm going to change the blending mode back to normal. And then I'm just going to lower the opacity until it looks good or natural. So around 30% looks pretty good, but I'm going to take it a step further and go to my blending options. And I'm going to blend it with the underlying layer. So this will allow some of the lighter parts to pass through. So making it look a bit better. Alright, there we go. And I'm just going to increase the opacity to 40%, so I think that will be just a bit better. And that looks pretty good. Okay, the next thing I want to do is increase the contrast of the mountain, because the star trails over here, it has a lot of contrast, but this doesn't have much. So I want to make them look a bit more realistic. So I'm going to add a curve adjustment just to below the star trail layer so that only the foreground is going to be affected. So I want to bring out the last bit of light on these valleys on the mountain. So I'm going to go to a bright area of one of these peaks. I'm going to bring that up a little bit. And then go to a dark area and bring that down. So that's going to increase the contrast and bring out more detail in there. Alright, so that's looking pretty good. I think it's too bright though. So I'm just going to take this point and just bring it back down a little bit. I'm actually going to take this point down a little bit more so that the shadows get darkened. That's too dark though. Alright, that's pretty good. The next thing I want to do is adjust the color of the mountain a little bit. So I'm going to add a curve adjustment. I'm going to change the blending mode to color so that only the color of the anything I adjust in this curve adjustment, only the color will be affected on the layer. So I want to reduce the amount of blue in the layer. But I'm just going to try to bring it up just a little bit in the shadows. So I want less in the highlights and midtones, less blue. And I'm also going to try to play around with the red, see how that looks. Okay, maybe I'll just increase it just a little bit. So I'm liking that color adjustment. Let's try adding a little bit of green in the bright parts. Alright, so I'm liking the colors of this, and I want to adjust the color of the sky a little bit. So I'm going to take this mask of the sky and then create a curve adjustment. So I want it to be a bit of a more of a cyan kind of color. So I'm going to try to add more blue. And more green. And a little bit less red in the shadows or dark parts. Alright, so I'm really liking that adjustment. I think that looks pretty good. Next thing I want to get rid of is the color cast. So it's still in these rocks in the foreground, the red kind of magenta color cast. So I'm just going to create a curve adjustment. And I'm just going to take down the reds. And forgot to change the blending mode to color. Alright. So I'm going to invert this mask so that I can paint it in manually. So I'm going to go to my brush tool. Make sure the brush is on white. I'll set the opacity to around 50%. So I'm going to paint multiple passes over here onto the rocks in the foreground. Alright, that's pretty good. And just one more, I need to duplicate this layer because I need to add more in the edges over here. So I'm gonna fill it with black again. I'm gonna reset that and then use my white brush to paint it into the extreme edges over here that need more. Okay, so that's pretty good. I'm gonna reduce the opacity of this a little bit. Alright. That's still not looking quite right, so I'm just gonna allow more of the layer to come back so it looks a bit more natural. Okay. I'm going to try to adjust the color just a little bit more. This kind of has a brownish tint, orange glow over here. So I'm going to find that layer. And I'm going to take away the red in that layer a little bit more. Alright, there we go. Yeah, and then this is looking really stylized, so this is obviously won't look realistic, but I still like it. And of course this is the more realistic look, but I kind of like the color contrast, so the red kind of brownish hint of the mountain and then the cyan kind of bluish greenish look of the sky. So to take this layer back a little bit, now that I'm looking at it for a few minutes right now, and so I'm just gonna take the effect back a little bit more to bring back some of the original color. Alright, and then I think that's good. So 50%, that's a bit better. Because after a few minutes of looking at that, kind of decide that it doesn't really look good anymore. So that's about it for editing the star trail image, and it was pretty straightforward. So I first edited the foreground and averaged out 16 layers so that I can get a noise-free image for the mountain. And then I added in the star trails layer by first taking out the satellites, cloning them out, the jet planes or the jet lines. I also did the rotation by 0.1 degree and made it the layer lightened so it filled the gaps. And then I added another layer so that it looks a bit more realistic. It added in the rest of the star trails with a low opacity. Then I increased the contrast of the foreground. I adjusted the color so that the mountain looked a bit more brownish and red. I also adjusted the color of the sky so it looked more cyan or teal. Then I removed the color cast of the foreground edge, and that's it. Alright, if you found this useful, please give it a like and consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.